Get your hands off her! No, drag her out! The words cut through the polished silence of the downtown bank like a crack of thunder, sharp enough to turn every head in the room as conversations died mid-sentence, and the quiet hum of wealth and routine collapsed into something tense, something charged, something ugly. Zoe Bennett didn't move at first. She stood there in a simple gray hoodie, worn jeans, and white sneakers that had seen better days, her hands loosely at her sides, her expression unreadable, not defiant, not afraid, just still, as if she had already seen this moment coming long before anyone else realized it was happening. Around her, the marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, the kind designed to make people feel important. But right now it felt more like a stage, and every eye in the bank had turned toward her as if she were the problem that needed to be solved. A tall man in a navy blazer, the branch manager, stepped forward with a tight smile that never reached his eyes, gesturing toward the glass doors with a sharp flick of his wrist as if dismissing her was as routine as approving a loan. "We've asked you nicely," he said, his voice low but carrying, practiced authority wrapped in politeness that had already expired. "You're disrupting operations." Zoe blinked once, slow, steady, her gaze lifting just enough to meet his, and for a brief second something passed between them, something he didn't understand, something he chose to ignore. "I'm just here to access my account," she said, her voice calm, even, the kind of calm that didn't beg for permission and didn't apologize for existing. A murmur rippled through the nearby customers, a woman clutching her handbag tighter, a man in a tailored suit glancing over his shoulder, curiosity mixing with discomfort as the air thickened. "That's not how this works," another employee added quickly, stepping in with crossed arms and narrowed eyes, as if repetition would turn assumption into truth. "You need proper verification." Zoe's lips pressed together slightly, not in frustration but in recognition, as if she'd heard those exact words before in a dozen different places, in a dozen different tones, all meaning the same thing. She reached into her pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out her phone but not unlocking it, not dialing, just holding it there as if weighing a decision. Near the corner, a young man had already lifted his phone halfway, recording, the small red light blinking like a silent witness, while an older woman leaned toward him and whispered, "This doesn't feel right." Her voice barely audible but heavy with something deeper than doubt. The manager's patience snapped a fraction tighter. "We're done here," he said louder now, the mask slipping just enough for the room to notice. "Escort her out." Two security staff stepped forward, not aggressive, not violent, but firm in the way people are when they believe they're backed by unquestionable authority. Zoe exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders relaxing instead of tensing, and in that moment, just for a second, it felt like everything slowed down. The lights, the whispers, the footsteps approaching her. She glanced at her phone again, her thumb hovering over the screen, and then she spoke, not to the room, not to the manager, but quietly, almost like a thought spoken out loud. "Okay." And then, just as the first hand reached toward her arm, she unlocked her phone and made a call. The call connected almost instantly, but Zoe did not raise her voice, did not step back, did not resist the quiet pressure of expectation building around her as the two security staff paused just short of touching her, uncertain now, because something about her stillness did not match the situation they thought they understood. "Hi," she said softly into the phone, her tone steady, almost casual, as if she were standing anywhere else but in the center of a room that had turned against her. "Yeah. I am at the downtown branch." A brief pause followed, and though no one could hear the voice on the other end, something shifted in Zoe's eyes, something grounded, something certain. "No, I am fine," she added, glancing briefly at the manager who now watched her with growing impatience, his fingers tapping once against his sleeve as if time itself was being wasted on her presence. "I just thought you should know what is happening." The room held its breath without realizing it, the low murmur fading into a quieter tension, the kind that creeps in when people sense they may have misread a situation but are not ready to admit it yet. "Ma'am," one of the security staff said, his tone careful now, less forceful than before. "We need you to come with us." Zoe nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she heard him without accepting the premise behind his request. "Give me 1 minute," she replied, still calm, still measured, and then she turned slightly away, her voice lowering just enough to create distance from the room while still being heard. "They are asking me to leave," she said into the phone, and this time the pause on the other end was longer, heavier, like a decision being made in real time. Near the front desk, a young teller shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking between Zoe and the manager, uncertainty beginning to replace the quiet confidence that had filled the room just moments earlier. The man in the tailored suit who had been watching earlier now stepped a little closer, not interfering, but no longer pretending this was none of his business. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice directed more at the staff than at Zoe, and the question hung in the air like a spotlight no one wanted. "We are handling it," the manager replied quickly, a little too quickly, his smile returning but thinner now, stretched over something less stable. Zoe ended the call with a soft tap, her thumb lingering on the screen for just a second before she lowered the phone to her side. She did not explain. She did not argue. She simply stood there, and somehow that silence carried more weight than anything she could have said. "Last chance?" the manager added, his tone tightening again as if trying to reclaim control that had already begun to slip. "Either you leave on your own, or we will escort you out." The word escort landed differently this time, heavier, more visible, because now the room was watching in full, not just glancing, not just whispering, but witnessing. A woman near the waiting area shook her head slightly, her lips pressed together in quiet disapproval, while the young man with the phone raised it higher, no longer subtle about recording. "She said she has an account," he muttered, not loudly, but loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Why not just check it?" The question lingered unanswered because the answer was not about policy anymore, not really. Zoe finally lifted her gaze again, not at the manager this time, but toward the glass doors at the front of the bank, as if she were expecting something, or someone, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. The manager followed her line of sight briefly, then scoffed under his breath, dismissing whatever she might have been waiting for. "There is nothing coming," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. But Zoe did not respond. She did not need to. Because just beyond the glass, a black SUV had quietly pulled up to the curb, unnoticed by most, its engine idling softly in contrast to the rising tension inside. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Zoe allowed herself the smallest exhale, not of relief, but of certainty, as if the next move had already been decided long before anyone in that room realized they were part of something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The glass doors did not swing open dramatically, there was no sudden noise to announce what was about to shift, but something changed the moment the black SUV outside came to a complete stop, the kind of stillness that feels deliberate, like a decision rather than a coincidence. Inside the bank, the manager straightened his posture as if reasserting control over a room that had already begun to slip from his grasp, his voice sharper now, more performative. "We are not waiting any longer," he said, turning slightly toward the security staff. "Please proceed." The words sounded official, procedural, but they no longer carried the same certainty they had just minutes earlier. Zoe remained exactly where she was, her feet planted, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze still directed toward the entrance as if the rest of the room had faded into the background. One of the security staff hesitated again, his hand hovering slightly before dropping back to his side, uncertainty now visible in a way that could not be hidden. "Sir," he said quietly to the manager, "maybe we should verify her account first." The suggestion landed like a small crack in the structure already under pressure. The manager's jaw tightened. "That is not necessary," he replied quickly, too quickly, his eyes flicking toward Zoe and then away as if avoiding something he could not name. "We have protocols for a reason." But the word protocol did not settle the room this time. It lingered hollow, questioned by the silence that followed. Near the waiting area, the woman who had been watching earlier spoke. Again, louder now, her voice steady. "If she asks to access her account, why not just check it?" A few heads nodded. The man in the tailored suit crossed his arms, no longer neutral. It would take less than a minute, he added. The manager forced a tight smile, but it did not hold. We cannot verify every claim without proper identification, he said, though no one had seen him actually attempt to verify anything at all. Zoe finally shifted her gaze from the doors back to the room, her expression unchanged, but there was something different now, something quieter but stronger, like a line that had already been drawn. You did not ask for verification, she said calmly. You decided I did not belong. The words were not loud, but they landed with precision, cutting through the room in a way that made people look at each other instead of at her. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no immediate answer came. Because the truth in her statement was too simple to twist, too clear to ignore. Then, just as the tension reached that fragile point where something had to give, the glass doors opened. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just steady. A man stepped inside, mid-40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that carried quiet authority rather than loud display, his presence immediate but not forced. He did not look around in confusion. He did not hesitate. His eyes moved once across the room and then settled directly on Zoe. And in that single glance, something passed between them that no one else could interpret but everyone could feel. The manager noticed him a second later, instinctively shifting his attention, relief flickering briefly across his face at the sight of someone who looked like a high-value client, someone who belonged. Good afternoon, sir, he said quickly, stepping forward, eager now to redirect the situation. We apologize for the disturbance. We are just handling a minor issue. The man did not respond immediately. He did not acknowledge the apology. He simply walked past him, measured steps across the polished floor, his focus never leaving Zoe. The room grew quieter with each step he took, conversations dissolving into silence, phones lowering slightly, eyes tracking him as if the entire atmosphere had recalibrated around his presence. When he finally stopped beside Zoe, he did not ask what happened. He did not need to. He looked at her for a brief moment, his voice low but unmistakably firm. You called me. Zoe nodded once. Yes. And then, for the first time since he entered, the man turned his head toward the staff, his expression unreadable, but his presence now undeniable. Who? He asked, each word measured, controlled. Authorized this? The question did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like a line being drawn, and suddenly, the room that had been so certain just minutes ago no longer knew where it stood. The question did not echo, it settled, heavy and deliberate, like something the room could not ignore even if it wanted to. No one answered at first. The manager's confident posture shifted just slightly, his shoulders tightening as he forced a polite smile back into place, the kind used when control starts slipping but pride refuses to acknowledge it. Sir, as I mentioned, this is just a minor situation, he said, his tone carefully measured, attempting to regain authority through formality. This young woman was unable to provide proper verification for account access, so we are following standard procedure. The man's eyes did not leave him, and that silence stretched just long enough to make the explanation feel incomplete, insufficient. Standard procedure, he repeated, not as agreement, but as if testing the weight of the phrase itself. Then his gaze shifted briefly to Zoe, taking in her calm, her stillness, the absence of panic or confusion that would normally accompany someone being removed from a place they did not belong. It did not match the narrative he had just been given. What did you ask her? He continued, his voice even, but sharper now, each word precise. The manager hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that pause was enough. Identification, he said quickly. And she failed to provide acceptable documentation. Zoe tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but there was something almost reflective in her eyes now, like she was watching a story unfold that she already knew the ending to. You did not ask, she said quietly. You assumed. The words landed again, and this time they did not just hang in the air, they shifted it. A teller behind the counter glanced down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk, while one of the security staff stepped back half an inch. No longer certain where he stood in this unfolding moment. The man in the suit took a slow breath, then turned fully toward the manager, closing the distance by a single step. It was not aggressive. It was controlled. Intentional. "Let us try this again," he said, his voice lowering just enough to command attention without raising volume. "Walk me through exactly what happened, from the moment she entered this branch." The manager blinked, caught between defending his decision and recalculating the situation in front of him. "She approached the desk," he began, his words slower now, more careful. "Requested account access. Her appearance raised concerns, so we initiated protocol." There it was again. Appearance. The word slipped out before he could catch it, and the moment it did, the room reacted in subtle ways. A quiet shift. A glance exchanged. The man did not interrupt him. He let the sentence finish, let the implications sit there, exposed. "Her appearance," he repeated, softer this time, but with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. Then he looked around the room, taking in the faces, the witnesses, the phones still held halfway up, the tension that had not left since the first command was spoken. "And based on that," he continued, turning back to the manager, "you decided she did not belong." It was not a question. The manager's mouth opened slightly, then closed, his earlier certainty now unraveling under the weight of something he could not control. "We were ensuring security," he said, but the words lacked conviction, like they had already been challenged before he finished speaking them. Zoe remained still beside him, her presence now less like a target and more like an anchor point the entire room was orbiting around. The man finally shifted his stance, his attention moving from the manager to the security staff, then to the teller, then back again, as if mapping out every piece of the situation in real time. "Did anyone," he asked, his voice steady, deliberate, "attempt to verify her account before asking her to leave?" Silence answered him. Not immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. The kind of silence that confirms more than words ever could. A few heads lowered. Someone near the back exhaled quietly. The man nodded once, almost to himself, as if a final piece had just fallen into place. Then he looked at Zoe again. Just briefly, and something in his expression shifted, not softer, but resolved. When he turned back to the staff, the tone of the room followed him. "You made a decision," he said, calm but firm, "before you gathered facts." And in that moment, the power dynamic that had once seemed so clear had completely reversed, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The silence did not break immediately, it stretched, deepened, and settled into something heavier than discomfort, something closer to realization as every person in the room began to understand that what had just happened could no longer be explained away with policy or procedure. The manager shifted his weight again, this time less controlled, his confidence thinning under the steady gaze in front of him. "We were acting in the bank's best interest," he said, but the sentence sounded rehearsed, detached from the moment it was supposed to defend. The man in the charcoal suit did not respond right away. He let the words sit there, exposed, as if giving them the chance to collapse under their own weight. Then he turned slightly toward the teller station, his eyes settling on the young employee who had earlier looked uncertain. "You," he said, not harshly, but directly. "Did she request access to her account?" The teller hesitated, her fingers tightening again against the desk, her voice small but clear enough to carry. "Yes," she admitted. "She did. And did you attempt to verify it?" he continued, his tone unchanged, steady, leaving no room for interpretation. The teller swallowed. "No, sir." The admission landed like a quiet confirmation of everything the room had already begun to suspect. A ripple moved through the crowd again, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. The man nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just the answer but the pattern behind it. He shifted his attention back to the manager, closing the space between them by another measured step, not aggressive, but undeniable in its presence. "So let me understand this clearly," he said. "She walked into this branch, requested access to her account, and before verifying anything, you made the decision to remove her based on what you believed she looked like." The manager opened his mouth again, but this time the words did not come as easily. We had reason to be cautious, he said, his voice lower now, less certain. Caution, the man repeated, and for the first time there was a faint edge in his tone, not raised, but sharpened. Or assumption? That word hung in the air longer than any before it. Assumption. It echoed without sound, settling into the expressions of everyone watching, reshaping the narrative, in real time. Zoe remained still beside him, her posture unchanged, but her presence now felt different, no longer isolated, no longer questioned, but central, undeniable. Near the back of the room, the man who had been recording lowered his phone slightly, not because the moment had lost importance, but because it had become something else, something more than just an incident. It was clarity. The man in the suit exhaled once, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. The movement drew attention instantly, not because of what it was, but because of how he did it, controlled, precise, like every action had already been decided before it began. He pulled out a slim black card, matte, unmarked at first glance except for a subtle engraving that caught the light as he turned it between his fingers. He did not hand it over immediately. Instead, he held it for a second, letting the room settle into the weight of what was about to follow. Then he stepped forward and placed it gently on the counter in front of the manager. No force. No emphasis. Just certainty. Run her name, he said, his voice calm, but this time there was no mistaking the authority behind it. Do it properly. The manager looked down at the card, his expression shifting as recognition began to creep in, slow but unmistakable. His hand hovered above it before finally picking it up, his fingers no longer steady, his earlier confidence replaced by something else entirely. He glanced at the engraving again, then back at the man, and for the first time since this began, he did not speak immediately. Because now, the situation was no longer something he could control. Now, it was something he had to face. The manager's hand tightened around the card as if holding it longer might change what it meant, his eyes scanning the subtle engraving again, slower this time, as recognition stopped being a possibility and became something far more real. The room did not speak, but it watched every movement. Now amplified by the silence that had taken over. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure, but even that small sound felt out of place. Sir? He began, his tone shifting, softer, uncertain. There must be some misunderstanding. The man did not react to the statement. He did not step forward or raise his voice. He simply stood there, waiting, his presence now heavier than anything that had been said so far. Run her name, he repeated, calm, precise, leaving no space for negotiation. The manager hesitated for half a second more before turning toward the terminal behind the counter, his movements no longer smooth, no longer confident, but deliberate in a different way, like someone aware that every action now mattered. He placed the card down beside the keyboard, his fingers hovering above the keys before finally beginning to type. The faint sound of keystrokes filled the space, each one sharp against the quiet room. Zoe remained exactly where she was, her eyes not on the screen, not on the manager, but forward, steady, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this moment. Behind the counter, the teller who had spoken earlier leaned slightly closer, her eyes scanning the monitor as the system processed the input. Then it happened. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a shift. Her posture changed first, her back straightening as her eyes widened, the color draining slightly from her face. Sir? She said, barely above a whisper, but the word carried enough weight to pull the attention of everyone nearby. The manager froze, his hands still on the keyboard. What is it? He asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer would not help him. The teller swallowed, her gaze still locked on the screen. The account, it is verified, she said slowly, carefully, as if each word needed to be placed exactly right. Executive level. The room reacted in subtle waves. A quiet inhale here. A glance exchanged there. The man in the tailored suit near the waiting area straightened fully now, no longer observing but understanding. The manager stared at the screen, his eyes moving quickly now, searching for something that would restore the version of events he had built in his head. That does not, he started, but the sentence did not finish. Because there was more. The teller continued, her voice steadier now, though still edged with disbelief. Primary account holder linked, family authorization, full access clearance. The words stacked one after another, each one dismantling the narrative that had been forced onto Zoe from the moment she walked in. The manager slowly turned his head, his eyes lifting from the screen to Zoe, then to the man beside her, and in that moment, something inside him shifted completely. Not confusion. Not doubt. Recognition. Real, undeniable recognition. Sir? He said again, but this time the word was different. It was not polite. It was not procedural. It was cautious. The man finally stepped forward, closing the small remaining distance between himself and the counter, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. Say it, he said quietly. The manager's throat tightened, his grip on the edge of the counter firm now as if anchoring himself. The account belongs to her, he said, the words coming out slower than before. The man did not look surprised. He did not react with satisfaction. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. Then he asked the question that shifted everything completely. And who? He said, his voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable weight. Authorized you to remove a client with executive-level clearance from this branch without verification? No one answered. Because now, the silence was no longer uncertain. It was exposed. And in that silence, the entire room understood exactly what had just happened, and more importantly, what it meant. No one moved to answer him, and that silence did not feel accidental anymore. It felt like exposure, like the exact moment when a story can no longer be rewritten because too many people have already seen the truth unfold. The manager's lips parted slightly as if searching for words that no longer existed in a form that could protect him, his earlier confidence now completely stripped down to something far more fragile. Sir, we were only trying to... He started, but the sentence collapsed under its own weight before it could reach a conclusion. The man did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt sharply. He simply lifted his hand slightly, not to silence aggressively, but to signal that the explanation had already missed its moment. You were not trying, he said calmly. You were deciding. The distinction landed harder than anything else that had been said. Deciding. It reframed everything in a single word. Zoe remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her face calm, but now there was something unmistakable in the way the room saw her, not as someone being questioned, but as someone who had been wronged in a way that could not be undone by a simple apology. Near the waiting area, the man who had been recording lowered his phone completely now, his expression no longer curious, but firm, as if he had already made up his mind about what he had witnessed. She did nothing wrong, he said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear. The woman beside him nodded. They did not even check, she added. The murmurs began again, not chaotic, but unified, shifting the weight of the room in a way that could be felt more than heard. The manager glanced around, noticing for the first time that the room was no longer behind him, that the quiet support he had assumed was never actually there. The man in the charcoal suit took one step to the side, creating just enough space between himself and Zoe to change the perspective, to make it clear that this was no longer about proximity, but about accountability. Let me be very clear, he said, his voice steady, controlled, but now carrying a level of authority that did not need to be announced. You had the opportunity to verify. You chose not to. You had the responsibility to treat a client with respect. You chose not to. And you had every chance to correct it before it escalated. You chose not to. Each sentence built on the last, not louder, but sharper, more precise, until the weight of those choices became impossible to ignore. The manager's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in his posture no longer hidden, his earlier control now replaced with something closer to realization. We can fix this, he said quickly, almost urgently now. It was a misunderstanding. We can resolve it right away. The man's expression did not change. "You do not fix a decision like that after the fact," he replied. "You prevent it before it happens." The words settled into the room like a final line drawn between what had been and what would follow. Zoe finally shifted her weight slightly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the faces, the witnesses, the quiet support that had grown in the absence of her having to ask for it. She did not speak. She did not need to. Because everything that needed to be understood had already been said. The man turned his attention briefly toward the teller again. "Pull the incident log," he said. "Time-stamp everything from the moment she walked in." The teller nodded quickly, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. No hesitation now, no doubt about what needed to be done. The manager took a small step back, his hand dropping from the counter, his authority in the room no longer something he could rely on. "Sir, please," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "We did not know who she was." The man looked at him for a moment, and for the first time, there was a shift, not softer, but clearer, more direct. "That," he said, "is exactly the problem." The sentence did not need anything else. It stood on its own, cutting through every excuse that had been building since the moment Zoe walked through the door. And in that moment, every person in the room understood the real weight of what had happened, not just who she was, but how she had been treated when they believed she was no one at all. The room did not return to normal, it could not, because something had already shifted too far, something deeper than a single moment, something that had been exposed in front of too many eyes to be quietly undone. The manager stood there, no longer trying to command the space, no longer projecting certainty, his posture smaller now, his presence reduced to someone reacting rather than leading. The teller continued typing, pulling up logs, timestamps, internal records, each keystroke now part of something larger than routine, part of a reconstruction of truth that had already been witnessed. Zoe stood still, but her stillness now carried a different kind of weight, not defensive, not passive, but grounded, as if she had stepped into a version of herself shaped by more than just this moment. And for a brief second, the noise of the room faded in her mind, replaced by something older, something familiar. She was 12 again, standing in a store aisle, holding a small item she had saved up for, while an employee followed her from one section to another, pretending to organize shelves but never taking their eyes off her. She remembered the way her father had knelt beside her later that day, not angry, not loud, just calm, explaining something she did not fully understand back then. "There will be rooms that decide who you are before you speak," he had said. "Do not fight the room. Let the truth walk in." That memory did not bring anger now. It brought clarity. Zoe blinked once, returning to the present, her gaze steady as the sounds of the bank filtered back in, the low hum of whispers, the soft clicking of keys, the shifting weight of people who now understood they were witnessing something more than a misunderstanding. The man beside her turned slightly, his attention moving from the manager to the broader room, acknowledging the presence of the witnesses without addressing them directly. "Every person here saw what happened," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that no one missed it. "Not just what was done, but how quickly it was decided." The statement was not directed at one individual. It was directed at the pattern itself. The manager swallowed, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority. "We can correct this," he said again, though even he seemed less convinced by the words this time. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket once more, this time pulling out his phone, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if each step followed a process already in motion. He tapped the screen once, then brought it to his ear. "Initiate internal review," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "Full audit. Branch level. Start with this location." The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. The teller paused for half a second, her eyes lifting briefly before returning to the screen with renewed focus. The manager's expression shifted again, this time not confusion, not uncertainty, but realization of consequence. "Sir, that is not necessary," he said quickly, stepping forward half a pace, his voice carrying a note of urgency now. We can handle this internally. The man lowered the phone, ending the call with a quiet tap, then looked at him directly. This is internal, he replied. Just not in the way you expected. The room absorbed that sentence in silence. Near the entrance, someone exhaled audibly, as if the weight of what was unfolding had finally settled into something real. Zoe did not move closer to him. She did not step back. She remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, but now the space around her felt different, no longer something closing in, but something opening outward. The man turned back to her briefly, his voice softer, but still grounded in the same certainty. You handled that exactly right, he said. Zoe nodded once, not as approval, not as pride, but as acknowledgement of something she had already understood long before today. Then he faced the staff again, and whatever remained of uncertainty in the room disappeared completely. This is not about a single mistake, he said. This is about a pattern that was allowed to happen. The words did not accuse loudly. They did not need to. Because now, the truth did not require volume. It required accountability. And in that moment, every person in the room knew that what came next would not be erased, softened, or ignored. It would be addressed. The word audit did not fade after it was spoken, it lingered in the air like a shift in gravity, pulling everything in the room into a new alignment that no one could ignore. The manager's face tightened as the meaning settled in, not just the review, but the scope of it, the kind of review that did not stop at one moment or one decision, but traced patterns, histories, choices made over time. Sir, please, he said again, but now the urgency in his voice was clear, no longer masked by authority. This can be handled without escalation. The man looked at him steadily, not unkind, but unmoved. It already escalated, he replied. The moment you decided who she was without knowing anything about her. The words did not rise in volume, but they carried further than anything else that had been said. Around the room, the witnesses shifted again, not restless, but attentive, as if each person understood they were watching something unfold that went beyond a single interaction. The teller continued working, her fingers moving faster now, pulling up more records, cross-checking entries, the system revealing details that had always been there but had never been looked at carefully enough. Sir, she said quietly, glancing toward the man in the suit. There are prior complaints. The statement was soft, but it landed with precision. The manager turned sharply toward her, his expression tightening. That is not relevant, he said quickly, but the interruption came too late. How many? The man asked, his tone unchanged. The teller hesitated for only a second. 3 in the last quarter, she answered. All flagged but not escalated. The room reacted again, this time more visibly. A low murmur moved through the space, not loud, but unified, as if the pattern was no longer abstract, no longer hypothetical, but documented. The man nodded once, slowly, absorbing the information without surprise. And the common factor? He asked. The teller glanced at the screen again, her voice steady but careful. Customers who were questioned before verification. She paused, then added, all of them were people of color. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not uncertain. It was heavy with understanding. The manager's shoulders dropped slightly, his earlier resistance fading under the weight of something that could not be dismissed as a single incident anymore. We followed procedure, he said again, but the repetition now sounded hollow, disconnected from the evidence forming in real time. The man did not respond immediately. He let the words sit, then gently dismantled them. Procedure does not create patterns like that, he said. People do. The distinction settled into the room, undeniable. Zoe stood beside him, her gaze moving briefly across the teller, then to the manager, then back forward, her expression calm but grounded in something deeper now, something that reflected not just this moment, but the accumulation of moments like it. The man turned slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice. This is why verification exists, he said. Not to protect the institution from people, but to protect people from assumption. The statement reframed everything again, shifting the meaning of every action that had been taken since Zoe walked through the door. Near the entrance, a man who had been silent the entire time spoke up. "She never raised her voice," he said. "Not once." Another person nodded. "She just asked to be treated fairly." The manager looked around, seeing now that the room was no longer neutral, that the narrative he had relied on had been replaced by something clearer, something shared. He took a step back, his hand brushing the edge of the counter as if searching for stability. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter. Stripped of its earlier certainty. The man in the charcoal suit did not hesitate this time. "No," he said, his tone steady, final. "We document everything." He turned slightly toward the teller again. "Flag the incident. Attach all witness statements if available. Pull internal footage from the last 30 minutes. The teller nodded quickly, already moving to comply. The manager exhaled slowly, the weight of consequence settling fully into place. Zoe remained still, but for the first time, she shifted her gaze toward him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. Because this was never about proving who she was. It was about revealing how quickly they decided she was no one. And now, that decision had a record. The room did not return to its earlier rhythm, it stayed suspended in that space between realization and consequence, where every movement carried meaning and every silence confirmed what could no longer be denied. The teller continued entering commands, flagging records, pulling timestamps, her hands steady now with purpose rather than hesitation, while the soft glow of the monitor reflected the unfolding documentation of everything that had just occurred. The manager stood a step back from the counter, no longer trying to lead, no longer trying to correct the narrative, because there was nothing left to reshape. "Sir," he said again, but this time the word carried something different, not authority, not even urgency, but acceptance beginning to form beneath the surface. "We can cooperate fully. Whatever is needed." The man in the charcoal suit regarded him for a moment, measuring not the words, but the shift behind them. "You will," he said calmly, not as a demand, but as a statement of fact. Then he turned slightly, his attention moving across the room, acknowledging the presence of the witnesses once more, the quiet accountability that had formed without being asked. "If anyone here was directly involved or witnessed the interaction," he added, "you may be asked to provide a statement. Transparency matters." The words were not loud, but they settled into the room with clarity, and several people nodded almost instinctively, their earlier uncertainty now replaced with a sense of responsibility. The man near the entrance who had spoken before lifted his hand slightly. "I will," he said. "I saw everything from the moment she walked in." Another voice followed. "Same here." The momentum did not feel forced. It felt natural, like something that had been waiting to happen. Zoe listened, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet recognition in her eyes, not of victory, but of alignment, as if the truth had finally found its place in the open. The man beside her glanced at her briefly, not to check on her, but to acknowledge her presence in a way that did not need explanation. Then he turned back to the staff. "Bring up her full account profile," he said, his tone steady. "On screen." The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, stepping forward again, his movements now careful, precise, as he navigated the system under the watch of the entire room. The monitor shifted, loading the profile, and when it appeared, the teller instinctively leaned back slightly, giving space, as if the information itself carried weight. The manager swallowed, reading silently, his expression tightening again, but this time not in resistance, but in realization of the full context he had ignored. "Say it out loud," the man said, his voice calm, leaving no room for avoidance. The manager hesitated, then spoke, each word slower than the last. "Zoe Bennett," he read. "Authorized account holder. Executive tier access. Family linked account under primary holder Marcus Bennett." The name settled into the room, and for those who recognized it, the reaction was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. A shift in posture. A glance exchanged. A quiet intake of breath. The man did not react to the recognition. He did not emphasize it. He simply let it exist. Then he asked the final question that brought everything into full clarity. "And who," he said, his voice steady, grounded, "is Marcus Bennett?" The manager's throat tightened again, but this time there was no hesitation left. "Chief Executive Officer," he said quietly, "of the banking group." The silence that followed was complete. Not uncertain. Not tense. Final. Because now, there was no gap left between what had happened and what it meant. The man stepped forward just enough to stand fully beside Zoe, not in front of her, not over her, but with her, his presence aligned rather than overshadowing. "And she," he said, his tone unchanged, but carrying the full weight of the moment, "is his daughter." The words did not need emphasis. They did not need repetition. They landed exactly where they needed to, reshaping every assumption that had been made from the moment Zoe walked through the door. Around the room, the understanding was immediate. This was not a misunderstanding. It was exposure. And now, it could not be undone. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a finality that no one could challenge, as if every assumption that had been made just minutes ago had collapsed under the weight of a truth that had been standing there the entire time. The manager did not speak. He could not. His gaze dropped briefly to the counter, then back up again, but this time there was no authority behind it, no control left to project, only the realization of what had already been set in motion. Around the room, the witnesses did not whisper anymore. They did not need to. The understanding was shared, visible in the way people stood a little straighter, in the way their attention remained fixed on the moment as it unfolded. The man beside Zoe did not change his posture, did not raise his voice, did not move to dominate the space. He simply let the truth exist long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he spoke again, calm, precise. "The problem was never whether she had access," he said. "The problem was how quickly you decided she did not deserve it." The sentence landed with more weight than any title or position ever could. The manager inhaled slowly, his chest rising as if preparing to respond, but whatever he intended to say shifted before it reached his lips. "I take full responsibility," he said instead, the words quieter now, stripped of defense. It was not an excuse. It was not an explanation. It was the first statement that aligned with what had actually happened. The man nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of the shift. "You will," he said. Then he turned slightly toward the teller again. "Continue documenting," he added. "Include his statement." The teller nodded immediately, her fingers moving again across the keyboard, logging every word, every detail, every timestamp that would now form part of a permanent record. Zoe stood beside him, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet clarity in her eyes now, something that reflected not just this moment, but the weight of moments like it that had come before. The man glanced at her briefly, then addressed the room once more. "This is not about status," he said. "It is not about titles, or accounts, or access levels." His gaze moved across the faces, the witnesses, the staff, the people who had watched the situation unfold from uncertainty to clarity. "It is about how you treat someone when you think they do not matter." The words did not accuse loudly, but they reached further than anything else had. A man near the back nodded slowly. "That is exactly what this was," he said. Another voice followed. "She was calm the whole time." The room had shifted completely now, not just in understanding, but in alignment. The manager closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, the weight of what had happened fully present. "I understand," he said quietly. The man in the charcoal suit regarded him for a moment, then stepped slightly to the side, his attention no longer fixed on one person, but on the system that had allowed the moment to happen. "Understanding is the first step," he said. "Accountability is the next." He reached into his jacket once more, retrieving his phone again, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. He tapped the screen and spoke clearly. "Proceed with personnel review," he said. "Effective immediately." The words were simple, but their meaning was not. The manager's shoulders lowered further, not in defeat, but in acceptance of what had already begun. The teller paused briefly, then continued working, her role now part of something larger than routine. Zoe finally shifted her stance slightly, her gaze moving across the room one last time, taking in the faces, the witnesses, the people who had seen her not as a question anymore, but as a person who had been treated unfairly. She did not smile. She did not speak. She did not need to. Because the truth had already been spoken in a way that could not be undone. And in that moment, the room understood something that went beyond titles, beyond power, beyond identity. Respect was never supposed to be conditional. It was supposed to be the starting point. The shift was no longer subtle, it was complete, visible in every corner of the room, in every posture, in every silence that now carried understanding instead of uncertainty. The manager stood still, no longer attempting to speak, no longer trying to redirect what had already been set into motion, his earlier authority replaced with something quieter, something that resembled reflection rather than resistance. The teller continued documenting, her screen filled with logs, timestamps, statements, each entry forming a record that would not fade once the moment passed. The man in the charcoal suit lowered his phone slowly, the call already made, the process already underway, and for the first time since he entered, he allowed the room to breathe without adding to it. Zoe stood beside him, her presence unchanged, but the space around her had transformed completely, no longer a place that questioned her, but one that now recognized what had been overlooked. Near the entrance, one of the witnesses stepped forward slightly, his voice steady but respectful. "Sir," he said, addressing the man, "I just want to say, she handled that with more composure than anyone else in here." The statement did not disrupt the moment. It affirmed it. The man nodded once, acknowledging the observation without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. "Composure is not the absence of pressure," he said calmly. "It is control in the presence of it." The words settled gently, adding another layer to what had already been revealed. Zoe glanced briefly toward the speaker, then back ahead, her expression still grounded, still quiet, but there was a subtle shift now, not relief, not pride, but recognition of something that had been tested and held. The manager finally moved, just slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the counter again, not to assert control, but to steady himself. "I will cooperate fully," he said again, his voice low, consistent now, no longer searching for a way out, but accepting the direction things were heading. The man regarded him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You will have the opportunity to explain," he said. "But the record will speak first." The distinction was clear. Words would follow facts, not replace them. Behind the counter, the teller turned the screen slightly, ensuring the incident report was fully visible, complete, every detail accounted for. The room did not react loudly, but the awareness was shared. This was no longer a private interaction. It was a documented moment. Zoe shifted her weight slightly, then looked toward the exit, not in a hurry, not to leave, but as if acknowledging that the space had served its purpose. The man followed her gaze briefly, then turned back to the staff one last time. "This branch does not get defined by its policies," he said. "It gets defined by the people who apply them." The statement lingered, not as criticism, but as a standard. The teller nodded almost instinctively. One of the security staff lowered his gaze, reflecting in silence. The manager did not respond, but the understanding was visible in the way he stood, the way he no longer tried to reshape what had already been revealed. Zoe finally took a small step forward, not toward the exit yet, but toward the counter, her movement calm, unhurried, as if reclaiming the space that had tried to push her out. She placed her phone gently on the surface, her voice even. "I would still like to access my account," she said. The sentence was simple, but it carried a quiet power, not because of who she was, but because of what had just been exposed. The teller nodded immediately. "Of course," she said, her tone respectful, but more importantly, consistent, not influenced by titles, not reactive to revelation, but aligned with what should have been there from the beginning. As she began processing the request, the man stepped back slightly, giving space, not because he needed to, but because he chose to, allowing Zoe to stand on her own, exactly where she had always belonged. The room watched, not in tension anymore, but in understanding, as the final shift completed itself, not through force, not through volume, but through truth that had finally been allowed to stand on its own. The transaction completed without delay, without friction, without question, exactly as it should have from the very beginning, and that simplicity carried more weight than anything that had happened before it. The teller handed Zoe the confirmation, her tone steady, respectful, consistent, not elevated by who Zoe was, but aligned with what should have always been offered. "Is there anything else you need today?" she asked. Zoe glanced at the receipt briefly, then shook her head. "No," she said calmly. "That will be all." Her voice did not carry resentment. It did not carry triumph. It carried clarity. The kind that comes from seeing something for exactly what it is, and no longer needing to argue with it. The man beside her watched quietly, not stepping in, not adding to the moment, allowing it to resolve on its own terms. Around them, the room remained still, not tense, not uncertain, but aware, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed something that would not fade when they walked out those doors. The manager stood behind the counter, his posture no longer defensive, no longer rigid, but reflective, his gaze lowered slightly as the final steps of the interaction played out without his control. He did not interrupt. He did not attempt to correct anything. Because there was nothing left to correct. The record had been made. The pattern had been exposed. And the consequence was already in motion. Zoe picked up her phone, sliding it into her pocket, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if reclaiming not just the space, but the narrative that had tried to define her moments earlier. She turned slightly toward the exit, then paused, just for a second, her gaze moving across the room one last time. Not searching. Not questioning. Just seeing. The witnesses met her eyes briefly, some nodding, some simply holding her gaze in quiet acknowledgement. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. They had seen what happened. And they understood it. The man stepped forward then, not ahead of her, but beside her, his presence aligned, not leading, not overshadowing, just present. As they moved toward the doors, he spoke, not loudly, not to command the room, but clearly enough that those who needed to hear it would. "Respect is not something you offer after you recognize value," he said. "It is something you show before you decide it." The words settled into the space they left behind, not as a reprimand, but as a standard. The doors opened, the light from outside cutting softly across the polished floor, and for the first time since Zoe had walked in, the space felt like it was returning to itself, but not the version it had been before. Something had changed. Outside, the air was quieter, cooler, untouched by the tension that had filled the room moments earlier. Zoe stepped forward, then stopped briefly, turning her head slightly toward him. "You did not have to come down here," she said. The man looked at her, his expression steady, but softer now in a way that did not weaken his presence. "I did," he replied. "Because moments like that do not fix themselves." Zoe nodded once, understanding not just the words, but the meaning behind them. He did not come because of who she was. He came because of what had happened. And that difference mattered. They continued walking, the bank behind them now just a building again, no longer the center of what had just unfolded. Inside, the room slowly resumed movement, but not without change. The teller continued her work, more aware now, more precise. The security staff stood differently, less certain of assumption, more conscious of action. And the manager remained where he was, not frozen, but thinking, the weight of the moment settling into something that would not be easily dismissed. Because what had happened was not loud. It was not chaotic. It was not dramatic in the way people expect conflict to be. It was quiet. Controlled. Precise. And that is what made it undeniable. Zoe did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to argue. She did not need to prove anything in the way they expected. She simply stayed. and in staying, she let the truth arrive on its own. And when it did not just correct the moment. It revealed it. Not as a mistake, but as a choice.